Good afternoon. My name is Zakir Dumueric. I'm one of the co-founders at Censys, and I'm excited to be here today with Mike Hanley, Chief Security Officer at GitHub, and Aaron Stanley, the Global Head of Cybersecurity at Twilio, for what should be a fun discussion of security issues in the cloud in 2021. We're going to start with some brief introductions and then jump right in. And with that, I will hand the mic over to Michael Hanley.
Great, thank you, Zakir. Appreciate you having me here today. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Hanley, Chief Security Officer at GitHub, and joined the company earlier this year after previously having been the CISO for Cisco Systems, which I joined by way of the acquisition of Duo Security back in 2018. So spent about 5 years building and leading the security team at Duo and going through everything from FedRAMP to everything associated with sort of growing that company from sort of an earlier stage business to a large acquisition into Cisco. And prior to my Duo days, I spent a lot of time running around the federal government, working for the CERT Coordination Center and mostly working on applied R&D problems for the US DoD and other government customers. So thanks again for having me here today, Zakir.
Aaron, you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me and hosting. My name is Aaron Stanley. I head up the global cybersecurity program at Twilio Inc., as you said, Zakir. Twilio, if you're not familiar with us, I promise you that we have had some impact in your life. We're one of those brands that just exists behind the scenes in a lot of things. Founded over 10 years ago with the mission to democratize communications for application developers. We work across every channel of communication: voice, SMS, email, WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, lots of different ways for our customers to communicate with their customers in a B2B2C world. And right now, I oversee the global program that tries to protect all of those messages as they flow through our systems. It's a phenomenal job. It's a huge job. The company has grown significantly in the 3.5 years since I've joined. And prior to Twilio, I was over at Apple in the information security team and one of the engineering teams, doing a lot of interesting incident response work, as well as building out some big systems for litigation search. Prior to that, I was in law school, and prior to that at Strauss Friedberg doing forensics. So a long, interesting, winding path that I am really excited to talk to you about today, and how I've gotten to where things are and how I see the world of cloud.
Well, thank you both for spending the time today. It's great to get both of your perspectives on this issue. Just to start out, I think we've all gotten fairly used to seeing news stories about cloud breaches, documents being leaked from S3, Elasticsearch servers. As you read through these stories, as you think about kind of the problems you see in your organizations and how you go about securing the cloud, like what worries you the most about companies moving to the cloud more broadly?
I'll start. Zakir, I think the big thing that I think about a lot in this space is, cloud as a paradigm is like transformative to business in terms of how we think about consumption of compute and availability of resources and ease of provisioning and flexibility and our ability to have, data residency by adopting services in particular regions, et cetera. But, one of the big pickles here, as and I think as you sort of alluded to, is the propensity for misconfiguration or accidental sort of forgetting of what you've provisioned and set off in the environment means that it's also just as easy to accumulate technical debt quite quickly. So your ability to have provenance over, exactly what do I have in the cloud, how is it configured, who's responsible for it, what data lives where, becomes a slightly different problem than what you think about in sort of a more traditional, like I own the hardware context, because again, the barrier to entry is so low for me to be able to sort of spin up, an EC2 instance or a Windows VM in Azure, or to be able to deploy a serverless function in a different stack that, it's easy to get lost in the system. So I think your ability as a security team in particular to have some visibility and governance, and then to be able to provide accountability for those things relative to what your expectations are for system configuration, just becomes a little bit more complex by way of sort of the multiplicative power of being able to provision cloud resources quickly. So that's sort of the big area for me, is knowing that it's harder to keep track of. It's much more robust in volume potentially in a lot of these cases, and you've potentially got configuration drift that's much harder to manage at that scale.
Yeah, I think that rings true. I think about things like, how hard is it for us as a security team to get our heads around all of these new services that are being rolled out by the cloud providers? So even if we understand how S3 works in AWS, and we know which buttons to click and which switches to flip to make sure that a bucket doesn't go public when an engineer tries, do we know the same thing about how it works in Azure or in GCP or in other cloud providers that the engineers might decide they're going to go and spin stuff up in? So even if we govern some of what they can do, we're still, I think, behind the curve a lot of the time. And I mean, this is not like a new security thing, right? We're constantly behind the curve in terms of what engineers tend to do. But in this case, it's really devastating if an engineer does go put a bunch of data up in a thing that we don't understand. And even if we could govern it, we would still not understand what necessarily it means for the trust boundaries that have been created, where there might be inherent trust between one system and that system. And trying to figure those things out, we spend a lot of time doing. And I think it's one of the things that keeps me awake, certainly, is how do we not say no, but not allow ungoverned assets to run rampant in the environment. It's a really difficult balance.
Mm-hmm. So as you think about this, is it the cloud is moving faster and that's more complex, or do you think that it's fundamentally different? And kind of based on that, I mean, I'm curious to learn about how you go about securing cloud. Do you think about this kind of in the same way you think about securing on-prem assets, but it's just that there are more places? Or do you feel like you have to have a fundamentally different approach for how you go about securing your cloud presence?
I'll take this first, Mike. I think it's interesting to think about the cloud as a novel property, because it really isn't, right? Like a lot of the things that make the cloud unique are really just creating the same problems that we've had in the past whenever there's a new technology involved or new technology released into the environment. So we look at things like serverless functions, where there's a unique challenge, but there's a unique advantage from a security perspective, right? Like you don't have an instance anymore. So you don't have something where you could have an attacker leverage a 0-day exploit in a patchable vulnerability. But you have a totally new set of problems in how your engineers might code that function, what you've created in terms of allowing that function to pivot into your environment, and essentially allowing somebody to execute code in your environment, but not in a way that you know or have experience with. So you have to adapt, but it's the same tools, again, that we're going to put in the mix in order to adapt, right? You're going to look at static code scanning to try to understand the function. You're going to look and try to profile things in the account and use tools like network monitoring, the same way that we would in a data center. It's just a slightly different way. And I think it goes back to what I was trying to get at before, where we're a little bit behind the times on how to do those things, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to catch up. And that's the challenge, I think, of this environment.
Yeah, I would agree. And I'd say too, like kind of to Aaron's point, it's just somebody else's computer. It's easier to get access to it than buying, bare metal and having to racket stack and cool and power that gear. And, with that, with the idea that this is an accelerator to engineering teams and to businesses that are trying to innovate, you've got to kind of modulate the throttle on saying, how do I encourage and promote that, but not be an explicit blocker, especially for things that I may not necessarily be in the best position to actually, sort of issue a no on that front. So it's like, how do you allow for safety, have the right set of backstops to make sure that sort of known bad things don't happen, but create the space for good things to happen, and to sort of learn together with the engineering team on what norms might look like and what things you need to be able to basically figure out how to explicitly allow for, but have compensating controls in place to protect from those business processes or users running in a direction that you don't expect. An interesting thing that I would probably say too that people need to keep in mind is, you've got to kind of use those no's sparingly, because the big advantage again of cloud is like speed of provisioning and access. And especially in a large enterprise, you may have 5 different business units that think about how they use cloud infrastructure or what pieces of cloud infrastructure that they use from any given public cloud provider in completely different ways. So like what works for business A may not work at all for business B and may look nothing like the technology stack decisions of business C. So, thinking about like, what are your baselines? I mean, you've got to kind of have some flexibility and sort of learn and understand like, what's the business trying to accomplish so that you can appropriately sort of instantiate your controls and your risk management philosophy in those environments, knowing that they may not necessarily look alike based on the needs of those businesses.
So I'm wondering, if we dig in tactically, how do you go about trying to kind of build that environment where you can enable that type of speed and enable your development teams while also not blindsiding your security teams? I mean, I think we've seen many times now that, right, if you say no too many times, folks go off and they create external accounts on maybe the same providers or on other providers. So how do you try to incentivize everyone kind of to work within the space that you have oversight over without going out elsewhere?
I think that there's a lot packed into that, right? So one of the things that we can do and that we try to do is establish basic standards. So you want to spin up an instance, for example. Well, we have a hardened image that's based on, say it's based on the Amazon Linux distribution. We've done a lot of work to make sure that that image is appropriately secured and doesn't have the things we don't want and has the things we do want, but it doesn't work. Like what Mike was saying, business B comes along or business unit comes along and says, we can't run Amazon Linux. This stuff just doesn't work on it. We need to use something else. When you get to that point, you have to say, so let's take it down to lowest common denominator. What's the standard that we can apply? Can we say that no matter what AMI you build or no matter what image you use, it adheres to a CIS benchmark? And then you pick the level and you say, we want every image to be CIS level 1. We don't care how you do it, business unit, it's up to you, but we're gonna make sure with our auditing tools that you've done that. And then there's stuff like, how much infrastructure can we get into code? And it's not just because it's fun to do and buzzwordy, but it's because when you do that work and you have your software-defined networks and all of your infrastructure built into a GitHub repository, then we can look and we can use tools to say, what should this environment look like? We think it should have the following features because that's what the infrastructure or the code for the infrastructure says. Then we can go to the actual infrastructure, we can query the APIs, and we can say, what is it as built? And we can compare the two. And then we can look for deviations and flag on those deviations. And that, I think, is what is really key to focusing the security team on the things that could be anomalies and not worrying as much about the things that we've agreed are okay. Because we've scanned it in the repository, we've decided that granting the permission that you're about to grant to a particular role is a legitimate grant. It's not like a star : grant. And so if it's legitimate and it exists the way that it was defined, that's fine. And I think we can then focus on things where either it's an illegitimate grant, so it's star : or it's something that shouldn't exist. And we think that it was modeled wrong or somebody logged into the console and changed it. So I think those are the different ways, the two different ways that I've been thinking about it the most.
Yeah, I mean, I just build on that too by saying like some of the ways I've done this in past jobs and how we think about it at GitHub is like, how do you build the detection strategies so that you've got, relative provenance of everything that I believe to be my infrastructure footprint. And then you've instrumented such that you can say, do I have strong indicators and signals of things that I always want to be true and that they remain in that state, and things that I never want to be true or that are always bad, and that I can develop strong signal of those things. And I think you find that like you can probably find, and for every organization it's probably gonna be a different number, but say for the sake of discussion, you've got a sweet spot of like 50 of those rules. That's going to broadly cover sort of most of the things that your security team is going to care about, right? Like a root account was used to log into something rather than an individual user sort of going through a regular practice to get through, or changing of a security policy, or a some sort of start SR authorization, or a 0/0 firewall rule that gets put in place. Like those are things that should just not happen, and you should be able to have strong alerting signal, because basically what you're doing there is managing drift, right, from what your expected state or what you believe to be the healthy state that's in the middle of those two sets of rules should look like.
The one thing I'll add to that too, just circle back, is it's got to be simple too, right? Like you can't tell an engineering team, go implement these 400 controls and figure out how to do it. You have to be able to detect that drift. You have to be able to say, here's what I care about and here's what's important to me, and then go fix the 1 or 2 or 10 things, right?
So building off of that, I mean, how do you establish that kind of communication and that process with your engineering teams so that you're not always playing catch up to what they're doing?
I think a big part of like not playing catch up as a security leader is, just like any good product company or product manager, like you should really know your customer. And, you really, I think, have to think hard about like, what are the expectations of the rest of the business on a risk management perspective? And like, what are we trying to accomplish in engineering? And your goal in a lot of those cases, or if not all of those cases, should really be like, how do I assure success on a given company priority by protecting that opportunity and putting the right security measures in place to make sure that the good thing happens and that we avoid or mitigate the downside risk of failing to achieve that objective. And I think when you put security in that context, and this goes back to a couple of the points Aaron was saying earlier about like making it simple, make it easy to adopt the security controls, make it actually the preferred choice to adopt the security controls or the secure baselines and defaults, you're much more likely to realize a good outcome. Because that's a very like customer-centric view, right? Of if engineering is my stakeholders and I want them to be successful, how do I make this a great experience? And Zakir, I think you sort of alluded to this maybe earlier, that when you say no all the time, or you're a team that's difficult to work with, especially in the with the current availability of SaaS and infrastructure as a service, like eventually you could get to a point where people start to stray into shadow IT, right? And they say like, well, security team is a blocker for me. I'm going to just go figure out how to do this stuff differently. And the challenge that you run into there is because that's an issue. Basically, your customers are telling you that they don't want to do business with you anymore. And like you should be really thinking about like, how do I earn repeat customers as a security team? Like, how do I create great experiences that keep people coming back for more support or for more engagement or giving us more feedback on what those baselines are? Like really thinking about like what's a great customer satisfaction score look like? Now that doesn't mean I don't do the job of risk management and mitigation and securing the company or the product or the business that you're running, but making sure those interactions are constructive, they're transparent, they're well thought out, and that you have an empathy for what people are trying to get done in other parts of the business, and thinking about how do I get to a yes and here's how we'll do that securely, versus starting from a default position of telling people they're trying to do the wrong thing or leading with a no.
Yeah, I think that's the right attitude, and sort of to build on it. One of the things that we've done and lessons that I've taken for a while is nobody wants you to do something to them, but they definitely appreciate it when you do things for them. And so you try to sort of take that lesson from the hospitality industry and say, what can I do for an engineering organization? How can I help them? Because a lot of the time I'm going to come to them and I'm going to say, I need to know information, or I need you to do something, fix something, build something for me. But if I can go and I can say, look, I know I've put a lot of requirements on you, so here's how I'm going to make it easier. Here's what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to onboard you to this new tool, and it's going to automatically submit a PR when you submit something that violates a security policy. And then you're going to have an opportunity to unwind the change or take my take the thing that we've put in there that fixes it. And that, I think, has gone a long way to engender a lot of respect for a security team, as well as it helps the engineers keep their velocity up, because we're not saying you have to submit a ticket and ask for approval and then wait 3 days, because that's our normal turnaround time. But rather you're saying instantly, here, we found a problem, you could fix it right now. And that, I think, is really taking that page and helping enable the business and make it easier for them to develop securely.
So Mike, you mentioned shadow IT, and I'm curious, I think we've heard a lot about kind of how you think about the assets that you know about or in your control or within your kind of known provisioned accounts. How much does shadow IT actually worry you that people are bringing things up outside of your main couple of accounts on Amazon or Azure or whatever your cloud provider is?
Yeah, I mean, I think about it as like it's an ever-present thing. I think no matter what business or context you're in. But I think really where you have to start when you're kind of thinking about shadow IT is from the basis of people are generally well-intentioned and trying to get their jobs done as quickly, as efficiently, and as effectively as possible. And that like they're operating in good faith on behalf of the company in their employment capacity. So, I think if you start from that perspective and you realize that like shadow IT is just not out to get you, then you can have a little bit more rational discussion about it instead of thinking of like, why are my services not good enough? And I think like addressing shadow IT really then starts with sort of understanding like what's missing from the current suite of business capabilities and tools that sort of leads to this as, almost like a failure mode, right? Because it's basically a rejection of like, well, I either don't have what I need on the truck or what's on the truck is not good enough for what I need. Like that should be a strong signal, especially to like an IT team, that the needs of the business may either not be fully met, not be adequately communicated, or may be evolving in a way that they didn't anticipate. And trying to figure out how to accommodate that within reason, of course, is I think an important like mindset to take to that problem. Because what you can't have is like, customer data lives in 18 different services that are, not compliant with whatever your auditors are looking for, that present great risk to the business, or you have sort of massive, you can't have 10 different project management tools in a company. Well, you can, but that's going to come with its own challenges. I guess I would say that differently. So, but I think there's just really talking to those teams about like, why did the tools that we have on the truck that maybe are already approved or that have already gone through like procurement and security review not working for you, and like, can we make them work? Is there a way to make those work, or do you really need this other thing? So trying to understand, and again, assuming good faith in those discussions, I think is key. One strategy that I've used though to get a handle on sort of the scope of the problem that I think can be helpful is like, at the end of the day, somebody's paying the bill for shadow IT, and it can be helpful to, as a security team, stay in touch with procurement to say, hey, who are you writing checks to basically, or who you're reimbursing for software purchases, and use that as a backstop to try to figure out like, okay, if there's stuff that I truly don't know about, can I get, rational insights and reasonable insights on that from the teams that are actually paying the bills, and then use that as a vehicle to go back to the people who are consuming that software and saying like, is there something we can help with basically, or what might be missing, or how could we get you back onto the paved path from where you are, or include what you're doing as part of the paved path that we think about inside the business.
Oh man, that relationship with finance is critical. Like if you don't have it, and you go to your finance team and you say, hey, can you show me the expenses for the last 3 months where somebody might have put on their credit card or on their expense report, Amazon or Microsoft or any software, you will invariably, in a reasonably sized organization, find a ton of stuff that you didn't know was being used. And that's a really powerful way to get some control over the problem. But I think one of the interesting ways that I've been thinking about sort of the move to zero trust architecture and deep perimeterization, whatever you want to call it, is a lot of things are now attack surface, right? A lot of things that you wouldn't have necessarily thought were problems to manage have become problems to manage because people are running applications outside of your firewall or outside of your data center. People are running SaaS platforms and signing deals that you might not know about and not going through vendor review or procurement review. And you have, applications, third-party applications that people can use as plugins to Slack or to Gmail or to whatever, which are actually SaaS platforms and are putting corporate data on a cloud provider system that you don't know about and you don't have control over. So all of those things are really difficult to get a handle on as you allow engineers the freedom to innovate, and frankly, all staff, right, have the freedom to innovate and use tools like project management tools, like Mike said. And as those things grow, you can, as the security team, start to deny the run of that application, or you could start to block traffic to SaaS provider using your endpoint detection or your firewalls, and you could make people pretty angry by doing that. Or I think the strategy that Mike, you suggested is really worthwhile in a lot of cases. Guiding people towards the paved path, or here's the tool that we have. Let's talk to the vendor to make sure it does the thing you want it to do. But then there's also the idea that you could let it happen, and you can let it happen in a risk managed way. So not saying that this SaaS platform somebody signed up for is ungoverned, not saying that it's fully governed, but saying that you're putting some data in it, some company data in it, but it's not enough to trigger a full security response or full security governance. We just need to know about it. And I think one of the issues that I've had in the past, and a lot of our colleagues have had, is trying to figure out what those things are, and asset management just in general being a huge problem to try to capture. So how do we know that the data is there? Once we do, we can make decisions about it. But if it's just there and we're not aware of it, then it's a totally ungoverned risk, and nobody's accepted it and nobody owns it. And that, I think, is the real challenge of a security team today, is establishing that ownership so that we can make a good risk-based decision and say, yeah, in fact, if something went wrong here, it would not cost us enough to try to put an engineer on securing the asset. It's just not worth it. But we can't have those conversations if we don't know about the things.
Mike, I saw you unmuted. Do you have thoughts there?
I think Aaron summed it up nicely.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting that you bring up asset management. And I was kind of curious, I think both of you are running very kind of advanced, complex cloud management pieces. But as you think of folks who are moving to the cloud, I'm curious, what do you feel like are the most important pieces to be going after first? Is it things like asset management? Are there other kind of security approaches that are kind of the very kind of most important that you could be going after? And I think as a second part of that, how are you measuring success? What metrics should people be looking to decide whether or not they are securing their cloud, or what they're doing is working?
Yeah, so I mean, I talk a little bit about metrics for a second. There are a lot of bad security metrics out there. Maybe I'll start with saying that. For me, a big part of the strategy is thinking about like scorecards and baselines. And if you've got a published clear set of expectations that you've spent the time necessary with your stakeholder teams who are consuming that infrastructure to basically get an agreement and alignment on, these are the rules of the road, or we're going to adhere to say you're going to adhere to the Cloud Security Alliance critical control matrix as a baseline. And you say, like, we're going to focus our energy on instrumenting this as a broad sort of high signal security hygiene set of measurements that we're going to instrument and then publish and make available within the organization. That's important to get aligned on with your stakeholders, because what you don't want to do is have a game of like, hey, you've got a red metric over here, and the engineering team had no idea that you were even measuring that thing, or that it was important, or why it mattered, or how it contributed to a customer audit outcome, for example, or something like that. So really being upfront and socializing the what and the why that you're going to measure, so that people can generally agree, like, yep, that seems like a good thing to measure, and I understand how that contributes to a good outcome for the business or the customer. That's really important. The other thing that I would add to that are, you should, to the extent that it's possible in your business context, and I think part of this is where, like, different cultures or different engineering structures could play into how you approach this, but publish the scores broadly. Really what you're trying to get is, like, and I think Aaron alluded to this earlier, but like, if you make these things visible, really you're helping people make better decisions. I think, like, often, it can be difficult to sort of bring these security stories to light in such a way that doesn't feel like you're kind of raining on everybody's parade. But like, that's, I think the modern security team, a big part of their job is to really establish the visibility and the accountability for, are we doing the things that we said we were going to do from a security perspective or not? And it's not so much of a value judgment on like how you got there, but it's strictly a, like, where we have drifted, this needs to be addressed. The risk associated with that is, whatever you agree to, or whatever the security team can sort of come to consensus on with the teams, and then say, like, how are we going to solve this problem? It's not a, you did a bad job or you made a error over here. It's just a very blameless, like, we said the baseline was this, we're below that. How do we get back to the baseline? How can we partner to make sure that that becomes possible? You also end up too with an effect where you can say, if a particular project or feature team is really lagging behind the baselines relative to the others, like, you can sort of detect that maybe that's an area where you're underspent from a security enablement standpoint. And you can say, this team actually needs more support to realize good security outcomes, and, sort of unpacking that with the teams to understand the cause behind that can be an important trust building exercise with those groups, to make sure that, the desire is to make sure that they're successful, and you don't want to see them struggling, or maybe another team sees that they're struggling and provides an opportunity about, like, what worked well for them to achieve the security baseline targets that have been published. So again, I think that's just making that stuff as broadly visible as you can through, like, a scorecard program, for example, internally, can really help set clarity on what your expectations are, but also help identify when things are off course.
I love that idea. It's essentially trying to provide that visibility is really central to where we want to be, at least where I want to be with the program here. And I'd add that the ownership question is the one that I think I struggle with the most, because, look, we can't secure what we don't know we have. But it also becomes really difficult to, once we discover it, to understand who can secure it if it's something that needs to be fixed. And so, we need to be able to allocate those scorecards. We need to be able to allocate the risk. We need to be able to have a discussion at the executive level about whether or not it's okay to drift in a particular area, because we're trying something new. It's an experiment. It doesn't really affect the bottom line or matter as much. And we can't have those conversations effectively if there's a bunch of assets in the network that you don't know who belong, or who they belong to. And one of the things that I think has happened, at least in companies that have grown up in the last decade or so, is you have this push towards the Scrum team, and you have this push towards, like, a small, really empowered, really enabled group of engineers who go and build a solution for something and write a bunch of code. And then that code finds its way into the core of your application stack. And that team moves on, either to another product in the company or to another company altogether. And eventually something happens where the stack falls down, and you trace the root cause to those 15 lines of code that some engineer wrote and then stopped maintaining. And nobody knows how it works anymore. And nobody even owns it because it was a shared resource when it was created originally. And so, we have these kinds of hidden risks in our environments. And one of the things that I think becomes really important as you think about either you're in the cloud and you have a lot of assets that are around, or you're thinking about migrating there, is how do you establish that strong ownership structure to begin with? Or if you're already there, how do you start to establish it now if you haven't already? And things like being able to tag resources in the cloud and understand that a human needs to be responsible for everything that exists in that environment. And maybe that human is the CTO or even the CEO. That's fine, but really you want to be able to move that ownership down to the lowest level. So once you find a problem, you have someone that you can go and approach and have them fix it. And I think that that's really something that I've seen a lot of struggles with. It's something that seems to take a backseat sometimes to just getting stuff out the door. But really, if you spent a minute or two up front, it's one of those things that pays dividends in the long run, because you'll know how to approach a problem when it happens.
So building on that idea of ownership, I think we've seen that mergers and acquisitions are just happening constantly these days in this kind of the tech community. How do you look at that and trying to drive ownership and understand what's happening when you acquire a company? Like, what's that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, the M&A process, I'd maybe related Zakir back to what we were saying a little bit about the idea that within a given company, you have a diversity of technology stack decisions, and what good looks like on stack A or product A may differ from what good looks like for a given expectation on stack B and product B. And I think the idea that you're going to like draw all this out in some pre-term sheet inspection and have clairvoyance and provenance on like all the security things that need to happen in an acquisition is, an idea that I would encourage people to not get too much of their hopes on. It's important, I think, as part of due diligence, but over time, as you integrate a product and you sort of discover more about like how things work under the hood and where the strengths and weaknesses of not just the technology as it was assessed at a point in time, but the operational practices behind it that support those good outcomes and the robustness of and sustainability of those. As you sort of unpack that further, like you tend to find more issues that you need to sort of solve and figure out like what the right integration balance is with those entities. But especially if it's M&A of something smaller or even medium size, I would say the idea that like some of these security sort of process areas like asset management and identification and inventory and sort of having a protection strategy for those may not be anywhere near sort of what the needs and expectations are of your business. And when you close that deal, it's your responsibility at the now acquiring company to take on and manage those risks. And I think just like acknowledging that there's going to be different levels of maturity, sophistication, and coverage in some of those capabilities for an acquired entity, or they may have a very different thesis on how they approach it, and figuring out how to sort of get back to that shared understanding of what good looks like, even if it shows up in a different way in the acquired entity because they've made different technology or business process decisions, or they have a different product than you've got. Still figuring out how to translate what your expectations are onto that business, and then again work to develop the paved path to help them adopt that as rapidly as possible. It still feels like the right strategy for me. So just much in the same way you'd approach a diverse business unit inside the company.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Mike because I think as much as we've done a bunch of acquisitions lately, he knows the road a lot better than I do. The one thing that I will add is, in the due diligence process, one of the things that I've found a lot of value in is doing an intel look at the company, as opposed to just trying to do a pen test and figure out, are there vulnerabilities that haven't been patched, or are there assets that we don't know about? But can we search the dark web? Is there any possibility that there is a group out there that has data that belongs to this entity? Because especially if you're a reasonable market player, once you announce the acquisition, that whatever exists out there is going to find its way into the public light, and you're going to have to respond to it. So knowing that upfront has been really useful for us.
Yeah, I would just like double down on that and say what the acquired entity thinks they know about themselves and share with you is one perspective. What you're able to figure out as if you were just sort of random adversary on the internet, sort of taking the standard, open source Intel approach to kind of figuring out like, what did this company do? Like, what kind of services did they have? Where would I attack? Where would I kind of poke? It's a complementary strategy to sort of marry those two things together and get what's probably not a complete, but a better look at what's going on. And again, a lot of I think the hard work, sort of unfolds, not just to manage the risk, but to continue the act of discovering and promoting your understanding of the discovery of the risk that you're doing as part of an acquisition happens after you close in a lot of those cases.
That makes a lot of sense. So I know we're starting to come to an end time-wise. I have one last question, and that's just that we've seen several, I think, recent big security breaches, right? If we look at SolarWinds, we look at kinds of Microsoft Exchange problems. What are your thoughts as you see these occur? Kind of what's your takeaway for what you do as a security organization? Are you able to learn from those? Do those change kind of what advice you'd give to other companies as you've seen those play out?
A lot of it for me is actually just reinforcement that the basics matter, and being brilliant at those are the most important things that you can do to increase the attack cost for an adversary on your systems and network. And I'll give a nod to the Censys team, Zakir, because I thought the Censys team did a nice job of saying, do people even realize that there are all these Exchange servers that are out there, unpatched, ownerless, not getting the maintenance that they need weeks after a patch was publicly available? And that's not to say that the organizations don't necessarily know about them, but I'm sure in some cases that was the situation. And it's very much a like, if I don't know about it, I can't deal with it. And I have, back to kind of what Aaron was saying earlier, you sort of have this unmitigated exposure and risk that the organization can't even reason about to make a decision as to whether that's the right or wrong thing to do. And that is very much the basics, right? Or even like look at the look at the cybersecurity order that just came out of the White House. A lot of what's cited in there are things that the industry's been kind of harping on really for years as best practices for cybersecurity hygiene. MFA everywhere, moving to a zero trust architecture, making sure you know where your stuff is, having a viable cybersecurity strategy and plan. So for me, there's something to learn from every single one of those events, but like a common theme that I take away from all of them is, gosh, the basics and the fundamentals sure would have made this attack more expensive or more complicated, at least for an adversary. It may not have fully stopped it, but the idea that having a reliable and sort of strongly attestable set of security foundations would have, if nothing else, probably allowed you to know about and mitigate the blast radius and increase the attack cost for any given event. So for me, that's always just a reinforcing thing of making sure that we've done an excellent job at the basics.
Yeah, I'll add two things in sort of a different perspective. Being on the receiving side of some of these larger issues lately, one of the really amazing things that I think I've learned and I think I've appreciated the most is providers like the cloud service providers like GitHub that we use in service forums where those providers have been exploited, and not directly, but maybe indirectly, to get information and intelligence from them so that we can either respond ourselves or we can at least be aware and try to put those IOCs into a detection system is just phenomenally important. And having been a provider in the past that has had to have conversations with customers to have similar kinds of here's the log data that we have so that you can investigate the issue that happened to your Twilio account. It's just really amazing to see the maturity of organizations and their ability to assist in those kinds of investigations, and to work with organizations that are less mature that cannot assist in that way. That is a takeaway for me on the vendor security side. and how I manage relationships with my third-party vendors is vitally important. And one of the things is being able to rely on them to help you investigate. And so knowing that they have mature programs, knowing that they can provide that information so that you can get answers in a crisis is really important. The flip side of that is I've also been on the receiving end of a lot of surveys that I have to fill out, or questions from customer security teams saying, are you aware of the Microsoft Exchange vulnerabilities, and what are you doing about it? And trying to figure out, like, what are we trying to do there? What is it actually the information security team, the information security community is trying to accomplish, is something that I've been wrestling with the last few months, and thinking about, are we doing this because our auditors tell us we ought to, but in reality, it doesn't help the ecosystem. It just kind of makes more work for security teams, which is good for employment, but not so good for actual security. I've really been thinking about that one a lot lately, and I'm working on an article to try to flesh out some of these ideas. But thinking about the supply chain attacks and what's our response to our vendors. Do we let them know that we know they have an Exchange server because we're monitoring them? That could be really useful, and we could try to allocate ownership that way. And I think that's probably a good thing. Do our vendors then need to do more, or do we need to send out more questionnaires? Probably not. Like, that doesn't really seem to help, especially in a situation where you're sending out a blanket set of questionnaires and most of the responses are, we've never heard of Fortinet, we don't use Pulse Secure, what's Exchange, we use G Suite. That's not terribly helpful. But I do think that they've been a good wake-up call for better vendor management in general, and what we do with that now that we have some really good beacons and examples of third-party compromises. That's where the rubber's going to meet the road for me.
Thanks. So I think we're coming to a close. Thank you both so much for taking the time today. This was wonderful. I think just to close, it would be great to hear what kind of any concluding remarks you have, questions we didn't touch on but wish we had, or just kind of what advice you have for others as they're thinking about how to secure their clouds.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first, and then pass the mic to Aaron. So honestly, for me, the best advice that I can give is to really focus on something that we said a little bit ago, which is establishing visibility, establishing sets of expectations, getting aligned on those expectations with your stakeholders and other parts of the business, and then just communicating early and often on how you're doing relative to those benchmarks or baselines, and thinking about managing drift from those as a partnership opportunity and activity. No security team today does the full effect of all things security related to the business. It's a give and take, it's a partnership, it's a cooperative activity, it's a team sport that you do with every part of the company. We even mentioned procurement earlier, which I'm sure probably doesn't come up all the time in security conversations. It's not just an activity that you work with engineering on. And I think that mindset of the only way for us to establish that provenance, that visibility, that clairvoyance of what we've got going on in the business is through partnership and through alignment on a shared perspective of what the right good security outcomes are in the business. Is like an absolutely just like critical mindset, whether it's like thinking about securing a cloud infrastructure or securing something else. That approach of like, we are going to try to get to a good security outcome for the company together, and everybody's got a role that they've got to play in participating in that. And the security team, of course, has a large explicit role, but really that acknowledgement that everybody in the company, no matter what their job is, the choices that they make have an effect on the security of the enterprise. And I think if you can start from that kind of a mindset and work to realize good security outcomes through influence and partnership, that's really, really big part of what I think leads to long-term success.
Yeah, there's no doubt that that is where we are. We've moved from security as know as a service to this world of enablement and partnership, and it's phenomenal. I always think back to my shift when I left Apple and I came to Twilio, and just the difference in opinion between people in my previous life and people in the life that I had then chosen to come to me and say, how do we make this more secure? How can we do better for you? Was something that I had never encountered before. And so to feel that and have that really has helped sort of rocket the relationships ahead. And so that's definitely on sort of top of the list for how to think about what a security team needs to do. The other thing that I'd say we also talked about today is you just got to do the basics. And to some extent, the basics are not fun. You don't wake up every morning and say, all right, I am super pumped to go patch that vulnerability. Like, you wake up in the morning, or at least the folks that really are motivated to do security wake up in the morning and like, I want to go attack something. I want to go find a bug in something. I want to go build a really cool tool that's neat and I can open source. And all of that is really great. And to see our team's energies going towards those things, and we've definitely, as a community, we've helped each other so much by having that energy and doing those things. The business functions, the customers trust you, the world revolves and you make money because you do the basics well. And then you can spend your time doing all the fun stuff. But you've got to get to that point where you have those fundamentals, and you can acquire entities and bring them into the fold, and you know how you're going to go assess what they're doing, how they're doing it, and help them come up to a higher level of maturity. So it's not fun, it's not always interesting, but it's really vitally important for the success of the business. And so if you want to be a security enabler, you have to adopt that kind of mindset. And then, maybe you can try to gamify things and make them more interesting. That's always an opportunity. There are lots of ways that we've been playing with, like internal bug bounty programs, and you have security days and fun little events that you can run to help incentivize people to do the basics well. But really, it's a cultural thing that you have to embed. And then as a security team, really help make sure that you follow the hospitality rule, and you do what you can for the team, for the engineers, to make them better and to make them move faster, and to make them safer. Because that, I think, is really how we will continue to build on the successes we've had of enabling business.
That sounds like fantastic advice from both of you. As we close, thank you both for spending the time today. I learned a tremendous amount. I suspect everyone else will as well. So once again, thanks.
Thank you, Zakir. It was really great to be here. Good to see you too, Mike.
Yep, thanks, Zakir. Fun to be here with you, Aaron. Thanks.